Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world of shadows, stripes, and make-believe barns. You're stepping into a landscape where nothing is quite what it seems. Imagine walking across a quiet English countryside in 1941. Fields rolling out in patchy greens. A crooked barn leaning toward the hedgerow. Smoke lazily curling up from what looks like a farmhouse chimney. The birds are chirping. A tractor rattles somewhere in the distance. Idyllic, right? Except that barn is hollow. The chimney smoke is cleverly piped from a hidden generator. And beneath that patch of field sits an aircraft factory, churning out Spitfires under a canvas disguise. You're inside one of the strangest chapters of wartime science, the camouflage experiments of World War II. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive long if you accidentally wandered across one of these fake fields and bumped into a guard dog. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through mud that clings to your boots as if even the earth itself is reluctant to let go of you. Overhead, a squadron of bombers groans like distant thunder. This is the Britain of the Blitz, where every night could bring a rain of fire. To survive, entire towns reshape themselves, painting roofs, stringing netting, and rearranging landscapes like a stage crew working overtime. Imagine a painter's brush, but on a cosmic scale, covering hangars with streaks of brown and green, creating optical illusions to trick German reconnaissance pilots. Historians still argue whether these painted landscapes really fooled the Luftwaffe, or if the pilots simply chose easier targets elsewhere. Either way, the sheer audacity of the attempt is undeniable. A field could be transformed into a decoy lake with just a glistening tarpaulin. Or a massive bomb crater could be painted flat to appear unscarred from the air. Your eyes want to believe the stage play, even when your rational mind whispers, "This is a trick." One mainstream fact to hold on to. Britain's camouflage unit, known as the Camouflage Directorate, recruited some of the brightest artists of the time. Painters, sculptors, and even stage magicians found themselves enlisted not with rifles, but with paintbrushes and rolls of canvas. The idea was simple. If art can fool the human eye on a theatre stage, why not on a battlefield viewed from the clouds? But alongside the practical work came fringe oddities that sound almost comical now. There are accounts of entire factories painted to resemble quaint villages, complete with fake laundry lines and plastic cows dotting the rooftops. One poor cow reportedly kept blowing over in the wind, leading workers to nickname it Dizzy Daisy. You can picture it, Luftwaffe pilots peering down at what looked like a sleepy farmyard, never realizing that thousands of rivets and wings were being hammered together beneath the disguise. As you keep walking, the sun dips low and shadows stretch like long fingers across the ground. It's eerie, like stepping onto a stage set where the props are just a little too perfect. Thatched roofs made of painted canvas sagging unnaturally, hay bales with suspiciously square corners, roads that vanish if you look at them from the wrong angle. The camouflage wasn't always flawless. From above, some of it looked convincing. Up close, it could feel like a fever dream of papier-mâché villages. Here's the quirky tidbit that makes you chuckle. One experimental scheme involved building entire phantom towns lit by dim street lamps to lure bombers away from real cities. These decoy villages, known as starfish sites, were designed to be bomb magnets. They had kerosene-fueled fires that could be ignited at a moment's notice, creating the illusion of a burning industrial target. Pilots, seeing the glow from miles away, would drop their bombs on what they thought was a factory complex, only to be tricked by a field of fire barrels. In one case, a starfish site absorbed the brunt of an attack that might otherwise have levelled Bristol. You picture yourself standing in one of these ghost towns as flames erupt in carefully controlled patterns. There's no one around, just the hiss of fuel and the low moan of the wind through fake chimneys. The sky glows orange, the air heavy with heat, and yet everything is planned, a performance of destruction designed to save lives. It's equal parts brilliant and macabre theatre. Yet, not everyone was convinced. Some contemporary critics sneered that these disguises were more for morale than real defence, a way to give the public a sense of safety. Historians still debate, were the Germans genuinely fooled, or were they just not interested in wasting bombs on sheep pastures? The truth is blurred, much like the painted barns themselves. Your footsteps take you across one last ridge, where nets drape over a hillside like giant cobwebs. Beneath them hides another industrial treasure, a hangar, its edges softened by camouflage paint that makes it look like nothing more than a rolling meadow. It's beautiful in a way, this strange fusion of art and war. There's a gentle irony too. Landscapes designed to look peaceful were actually part of the machinery of destruction. A final little joke to carry in your pocket. Somewhere, an artist trained in Paris, who once painted dreamy cafes and nudes, was now assigned to making sure that a fake pile of hay didn't collapse under rain. You can almost hear him sighing, brush in hand, muttering. I didn't study Impressionism for this. As the night deepens, you realise that this was only the first trick in a whole arsenal of bizarre wartime illusions. Painted barns, phantom villages, inflatable tanks, and even fake trees will line your path ahead. Each one stranger than the last, each one blurring the line between science, art and theatre, and you, wandering through it all. Find yourself lulled by the idea that reality itself can be stretched, painted and disguised, at least for a little while. You shuffle forward now, away from the sleepy fields and fake barns of Britain toward the rolling sea. The salty air is thick, clinging to your skin, and you hear the crash of waves against iron hulls. But tonight, those hulks don't look like ships at all, or at least, not the kind your mind expects. Instead, the vessels seem wrapped in dizzying patterns of zigzags, spirals, and chaotic stripes. It's as though a giant child has attacked the fleet with crayons, leaving warships looking more like carnival floats than instruments of battle. This is the world of dazzle camouflage, and you can't help but squint, as though the sea itself is playing tricks on your eyes. The idea was simple but daring. Instead of trying to hide ships on the vast open ocean, why not confuse the enemy about where they were going? In the First World War, British artist Norman Wilkinson pioneered this odd method, covering ships with geometric shapes that made it hard to judge speed or direction. The experiment carried into World War II, when convoys braved Atlantic waters infested with German U-boats. From a periscope, a zigzag destroyer could look like it was moving north when it was really veering west. Imagine trying to play a round of battleship with the pieces constantly shifting under neon lights. Historians still argue whether dazzle actually saved ships, or whether it was more psychological reassurance than practical science. The U-boat captains sometimes claimed it made targeting difficult, while other accounts suggest torpedoes hit their marks regardless of how many triangles you painted on a hull. But at the very least, the bold stripes gave sailors a sense that someone was trying something, anything, to tilt luck in their favour. You walk along the dock, running your hand across steel painted in surreal blues, blacks and whites. Up close, It looks messy, almost chaotic. But step back, squint against the sunlight, and suddenly the angles don't line up. The bow melts into the horizon, and the stern juts out strangely. You almost feel seasick standing still, as though the ship is moving even when it isn't. Sailors joked that the dazzle patterns might confuse them more than the enemy, and you can picture a fresh recruit staggering down the gangway muttering, "It's not the rum, I swear, it's the paint job." There's a mainstream fact here worth anchoring in your mind. More than 4,000 Allied vessels were painted in dazzle camouflage during WW. It wasn't just battleships, it was troop carriers, supply freighters, even oil tankers. Each design was unique, carefully considered, because repetition would have given away the trick. No two ships looked alike, making the ocean a floating gallery of bizarre modern art. And speaking of art, here's your quirky tidbit. Dazzle patterns didn't just belong to war. They spilled over into fashion, advertising, and even dance halls. In London, a dazzle ball was held in 1919 where revellers wore striped costumes inspired by ship paint schemes. Imagine ballroom dancers twirling under chandeliers, their gowns slashed with zigzags like battleships on parade. The line between war effort and trend-setting blurred until you could barely tell if you were on a dance floor or a convoy deck. Still, not everyone was charmed. Some naval officers grumbled that repainting ships constantly was a waste of time and resources. Paint chipped, weather eroded the sharp lines, and maintenance crews cursed under their breath as they reapplied stripes in freezing dockyards. Historians still debate if the camouflage was ever worth the gallons of paint and hours of labour. Some argue that radar advancements quickly made dazzle obsolete, while others insist it bought just enough time to save convoys from total annihilation. You stand at the harbour edge, watching one of these striped behemoths push off. Its massive propellers churn white foam, and its patterned sides shimmer in the low light like a zebra wading through surf. There's something strangely beautiful about it, ugly up close, mesmerizing from afar. And in that beauty, you feel the peculiar blend of science, desperation, and artistry that defined so much of the war's camouflage experiments. Here's your light-hearted chuckle for the road. Sailors often joked that if the stripes didn't fool the Germans, maybe they'd just hypnotize the sharks. Picture a U-boat captain staring through his periscope, blinking hard and muttering, "Is the ship moving or am I just dizzy?" Meanwhile, somewhere below, a very confused shark swims in circles. As the striped convoy fades into the misty horizon, you notice how the water swallows the patterns, leaving only faint shadows of geometry trailing in its wake. You're left with the sense that camouflage at sea was never about disappearing completely, just about buying a few extra seconds of hesitation in an enemy's mind. And in war, hesitation could be the difference between survival and sinking. The waves lap gently at your feet now, their rhythm steady, hypnotic. You lean into that rhythm, letting the painted ships drift farther away, until the sea is calm again, only the whisper of stripes lingering in the night. You leave the shimmering harbour behind and step into the low drone of an airfield. The smell of oil and gasoline stings your nose, and the ground rattles faintly as fighter planes rev their engines in the distance. You expect sleek silver wings, bold roundels, maybe a shark mouth painted on the nose. Instead, you find yourself staring at blotches. Strange, messy blotches smeared across the fuselage, irregular, splotchy, and downright ugly. For a moment, you wonder if someone let toddlers loose with buckets of paint. But then you realise the joke from the sky. Those blotches resemble the most ordinary, forgettable thing of all. Bird droppings. Yes, the so-called bird poop camouflage. Engineers had noticed that reconnaissance pilots often overlooked small, seemingly unimportant specks and stains. So why not disguise parked aircraft as a patchwork of dirty, neglected junk? From above, a pristine silver plane glints like a beacon, but spatter it with fake pigeon mess, and suddenly it looks like nothing more than a battered shell waiting to be scrapped. The irony is delicious. Machines worth millions, disguised as if pigeons had claimed them for their roost. Historians still argue whether this tactic was ever officially sanctioned or just a field experiment. Some suggest it was a morale-boosting rumour, spread among crews as a way to lighten the crushing monotony of repainting. Others insist that blotched, bird-dropping paint schemes really were tested on parked planes in desert outposts. Either way, the story stuck, precisely because it was so ridiculous and yet so plausible. You step closer to one of these aircraft. The wing curves gracefully, but across its surface, paint is dabbed in irregular splatters of white, grey, and faint green. Up close, it looks like an art student's failed abstract. Step back, though, and the illusion clicks into place. The sheen disappears, the form softens, and the plane's shape almost vanishes against the dusty ground. It's camouflage by embarrassment. No enemy pilot is going to brag about bombing a pile of trash. Here's a mainstream fact worth noting. Throughout WW, camouflage paint wasn't just about colours, it was about psychology. Air forces experimented with everything from muted desert sand to deep forest greens, even layering aircraft with experimental matte finishes that dulled reflections. Shiny surfaces meant death, muted, dull, and downright filthy surfaces meant survival. And here's your quirky tidbit. A few crews took the idea of disguising their planes as junk to absurd levels. There are stories of old tarps being draped over wings to simulate torn fabric, or spare tyres stacked near cockpits so that from above, it looked like a junkyard instead of a functioning squadron. Somewhere in the middle of a war zone, a mechanic probably muttered, "Don't worry, Hans, our best defence is making Jerry think we're already garbage." Of course, not all ideas were winners. Historians still debate whether blotch camouflage actually confused enemy reconnaissance, or if it just made ground crews roll their eyes. The effectiveness was hard to measure. Did the Germans overlook a field of planes because they seemed broken, or because they simply weren't looking in that direction? Camouflage has always thrived in that uncertainty. If you can't prove it failed, you can still believe it worked. You wander along the tarmac now, past rows of aircraft painted with every imaginable trick. Some have mottled patterns meant to mimic dappled forest shadows. Others are stripped with dark undersides so that, when viewed against the ground, they look like birds in flight. But it's the silly bird-dropping disguise that sticks in your mind. The sheer audacity of it, that in the middle of a global conflict, someone thought, pigeons, that's our secret weapon. Here's your laugh for the night. Ground crews often joked that if the paint didn't work, they'd just keep a few real pigeons around to finish the job. Picture a squadron leader pacing the runway with a bucket of seeds, coaxing a flock of feathered painters into action. Right, lads, cover every Spitfire with at least 3 direct hits before lunch. It's absurd, but in a war where inflatable tanks and fake barns were normal, absurdity had its place. The engines roar again, a sharp metallic whine that shakes the hangars. One of the blotched planes taxis forward, sunlight glinting faintly off its patched wings. For a moment, the camouflage seems pointless. Once the plane moves, it's obvious what it is. But that's not the point. Camouflage wasn't about making something invisible forever. It was about those few crucial minutes before detection. Minutes that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. You watch the aircraft lift into the sky, blotches blurring into streaks as it disappears into the clouds down below. The abandoned bird poop scheme lingers like a private joke among mechanics, artists, and soldiers who lived in a world where the line between desperation and creativity was razor thin. The runway grows quiet again. The painted blotches bake under the sun, blending with the cracked concrete. You take a slow breath, realizing that the war's strangest disguises weren't always about genius. Sometimes they are about laughter, a fragile shield against the darkness above. You wander now from the open runways into the cool shade of a forest. The air is damp, rich with pine and earth, the kind of place where every sound echoes a little louder than you expect. Birds call, twigs snap beneath your boots, and somewhere far off, a brook murmurs lazily. At first, it feels like peace, until your eyes catch a tree that doesn't quite belong. The bark looks right, the branches sway gently in the wind, yet something nags at you. Step closer and you see it, a hollow trunk, reinforced with steel, and a small slit carved at eye level. Suddenly, the forest isn't just trees, it's a battlefield dressed up as a woodland stage. This is the world of the fake trees. Camouflage so strange it feels like a fairy tale. During both world wars, engineers designed hollow tree trunks to serve as sniper posts and observation points. They were carefully built to mimic real trees, sometimes even replacing an existing oak or poplar with an artificial copy so perfect that soldiers on both sides kept walking by, none the wiser. You imagine being the unlucky German or Allied scout leaning against what you thought was a tree, not realizing someone inside was quietly noting your every move. Here's the mainstream fact. One of the most famous of these was the tree, observation post tree, used by the British in France during World War I, a design later adapted in WW2. These trunks were built by skilled artists and engineers, often at night, when real trees could be swapped for their steel and canvas replicas without drawing enemy fire. The process was so secretive that crews sometimes memorized the landscape in daylight, then rebuilt it by lantern light while bullets whizzed overhead. But here's the quirky tidbit that adds an almost comic twist. Some of these hollow trees were so convincing that animals treated them like the real thing. Birds tried to nest in their crevices, and squirrels scrambled over their iron bark. Imagine the frustration of the sniper inside, swatting feathers from his periscope or listening to tiny claws tap across the metal shell. War might be hell, but nature doesn't pause just because humans are busy being ridiculous. Historians still argue whether these fake trees made much difference tactically. Did a sniper hidden inside really change the course of a battle, or were they glorified peepholes that mostly ended up being shelled as soon as the enemy realized something was off? Some reports claim they gave vital intelligence, spotting enemy troop movements and artillery positions. Others insist the effort to build and install them was an extravagant gamble with minimal payoff. The debate remains unsettled, though you have to admit, it takes guts to sit inside a tree while artillery rains down around you. You press your hand against the trunk of one replica. The surface is rough, but if you look closely, the bark is painted canvas hardened with tar. There's a faint metallic chill beneath the disguise. Through the narrow viewing slit, you glimpse sunlight breaking through the canopy in shards of gold, dust motes floating lazily in the air. For a moment, you imagine the experience of the soldier trapped inside. Hours of silence, a cramped body, the fear that one wrong cough might give away the secret, and yet, There's something strangely poetic about it. The tree, usually a symbol of peace, rootedness, and timelessness, transformed into a weapon of surveillance. You picture a soldier writing in his diary, "Today, I lived as an oak." It's absurd and profound at the same time, like so much of wartime camouflage. Here's a little laugh to carry with you. There's an anecdote of one German soldier who supposedly relieved himself against what he thought was an ordinary tree, only for the tree to quietly swivel its periscope away in embarrassment. No one knows if the story is true, but it's too human not to believe. Somewhere out there, a hidden observer had the world's most awkward shift. You move deeper into the woods, noticing now how many things could hide in plain sight. A rock could be hollow, a bush might be cloth, a log might have a radio tucked inside. The war blurred the line between nature and artifice until even the ground beneath your feet felt untrustworthy. And yet, despite the strangeness, there's an artistry here, a blending of human ingenuity with the patient camouflage lessons nature had been teaching for millennia. As twilight settles through the branches, the fake tree looms behind you, blending once again into its leafy surroundings. From a distance, it's nothing more than a shadow among shadows. You wouldn't know it was hollow unless you pressed your ear to its trunk and heard the faint echo of someone breathing within. You step softly, letting the forest reclaim its quiet. The wind stirs, leaves rustle, and you can almost believe the trees are whispering to one another, real and fake alike, sharing secrets of battles fought beneath their canopies. You step out of the forest and into a wide, open plain. The horizon stretches endlessly, and the grass ripples like waves in the wind. At first glance, it looks like farmland dotted with tractors and haystacks, but as you move closer, the tractors bristle with antennae, and the haystacks gleam faintly with polished screws. The silhouettes of tanks begin to take shape, except they aren't tanks at all. You blink twice, rub your eyes, and realize you're looking at an army of cardboard, wood, and rubber. Inflatable battalions. The famous decoy forces of World War II. This was camouflage at its most theatrical. Real tanks were heavy, slow, and costly. But inflatable tanks, those could be carried under an arm, inflated in minutes, and lined up by the hundreds to make an entire field look like an armoured division was ready to roll. From the air, German reconnaissance pilots saw what looked like an impenetrable wall of steel. On the ground, Allied soldiers joked that a single wayward goat with sharp horns could puncture their entire defence. The mainstream fact is this: decoy tanks played a central role in Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception campaign that convinced Hitler the D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. Entire phantom armies were conjured from rubber and plywood, complete with fake trucks, dummy artillery, and even wooden aircraft parked on fake runways. These props, coupled with false radio traffic and staged movements, tied up German divisions in the wrong place. Historians agree that the illusion was critical to the Allies' success, buying precious time on June 6, 1944. Now for your quirky tidbit. Some of the inflatable tanks had a nasty habit of rolling away in the wind. There are reports of soldiers chasing after runaway Shermans like oversized balloons at a parade. Imagine the comedy. 2 GIs sprinting across a field yelling, "Grab that tank before Jerry sees it floating away." A war balance between life and death still found room for slapstick, but the genius of these cardboard and rubber armies wasn't only in their look. They were placed strategically where they'd be most visible from the sky, often near real roads and railways, to enhance the illusion of mobility. Even the shadows were considered. Crews sometimes painted darker patches on the ground, or angled decoys at specific times of day to mimic the way sunlight would hit a real vehicle. It was stagecraft with deadly stakes. Historians still argue whether the Germans were genuinely fooled or simply cautious. Did the Luftwaffe pilots really mistake rubber for steel, or were German commanders hedging their bets, unwilling to dismiss the possibility of an invasion at Calais? The debate endures, but the results speak loudly. The Phantom Army tied down panzer divisions that never reached Normandy in time. Sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as the hesitation. You walk among the Ghost Battalion now, your boots tapping on hollow frames. A tank looms beside you, its sides bulging faintly with air pressure. You push a hand against its flank, and it gives way like a giant rubber ball. The absurdity hits you. This thing, so laughably fake up close, was once a terrifying spectre to enemy eyes. War thrives on perception, and perception is easy to bend when you know your audience. Here's your moment of levity. One American unit reportedly parked a line of fake tanks in a meadow, then relaxed nearby playing baseball. When asked what they'd do if the Germans attacked, a soldier quipped, "We'll throw them the ball and hope they don't notice the seams." And yet, beneath the jokes lies something almost haunting. Standing in this empty field of phantoms, you feel the weight of human imagination pressed into service for survival. These were not weapons in the traditional sense, they were stories, performances staged on the canvas of Europe. And those stories, as fragile as cardboard, could tip the balance of battles. The wind rustles again, tugging at a rubber antenna, making it sway unnaturally. From above, though, it's convincing enough. A pilot with seconds to decide where to drop bombs would see only what he expected to see. Tanks massing, armies waiting. The illusion was complete. As the evening light washes over the field, the fake armour glows with a strange kind of beauty. Not machines of death, but props of hope. Reminders that sometimes survival isn't about brute force but about imagination. You take a deep breath, feeling the soft hum of the plane, and step onward, leaving the Phantom Battalion to its silent watch. The fields of rubber battalions fade behind you, and soon the ground turns into flat tarmac. You hear the faint clatter of tools, the cough of engines, and the hum of distant aircraft, though strangely, you can't see much at first. You squint. Ahead of you stretches farmland, patchwork fields, hedgerows, a little dirt lane weaving between them. It feels peaceful, almost dull. But the longer you look, the more your brain struggles to piece things together. That ploughed field looks suspiciously straight. The haystacks shimmer oddly in the light, and the farm road? Well, it seems to run parallel with a runway you suddenly realise is right there, hiding in plain sight. This is the story of the shadowless airfields, where engineers painted the ground itself to look like something else entirely. During THU, Allied forces built entire runways camouflaged as farmland or villages. At night, hidden lamps were arranged to mimic moonlight glinting across roads. From the air, German pilots scanning for bombing targets saw nothing but harmless countryside. On the ground, however, squadrons of fighters were taxiing, launching and landing right under their noses. The mainstream fact here, one of the best-known examples, was RAF Station Christchurch, disguised so effectively that aerial reconnaissance photos made it almost indistinguishable from nearby farmland. Engineers used paint, canvas, and even piles of brush to obscure straight edges. The biggest giveaway to a trained eye. You can paint a barn anywhere, but you can't paint away a perfect rectangle, unless you blur it with clever tricks. Now here's your quirky tidbit. To solve the problem of shadows, some crews experimented with lighting tricks. They called it diffuse lighting camouflage. Tiny bulbs mounted along runways and aircraft fuselages to erase sharp outlines at dusk. Imagine hundreds of fireflies stitched into the seams of a runway, glowing just enough to blend the airfield into the night sky. Some pilots swore it worked brilliantly. Others muttered that it made them feel like they were trying to land on a Christmas tree. Historians still argue whether these elaborate disguises were cost-effective. Did the camouflage really protect vital air bases, or were the Germans simply too overwhelmed to hit every target? Some bombing raids struck with devastating precision, while others dumped payloads onto decoy fields and walked away believing they had crippled an air wing. The debate lingers in dusty archives and dim lecture halls, but the truth may always be a blur, much like the painted runways themselves. You walk slowly across one of these fields. Beneath your boots, the soil feels strange, harder than it looks. The supposed furrows are wide brushstrokes of brown paint. The fence line is actually a string of canvas panels. A scarecrow leans in the corner, its arms crooked just so, but up close it's really nothing more than painted plywood hammered into place. It's a stage set, a country masquerade, and yet, when a Spitfire thunders in low overhead, wheels kissing the farm road before roaring back into the sky, you feel the genius of it. From above, that landing was invisible. From below, it was a miracle of coordination. A ballet performed beneath a curtain of illusion. Here's a moment of humour to lighten things. Ground crews sometimes forgot their disguises when enemy reconnaissance planes passed overhead. One account tells of a farmer's wife cycling past a disguised runway just as the Germans flew overhead, spotting the incoming planes. She threw her laundry basket over her head and sat down in the middle of the field. To the Luftwaffe, it probably looked like one very determined woman drying her clothes, completely oblivious to the runway beneath her skirt. As dust settles, the effect grows even stronger. Lamps flicker on, diffused under screens so they glow softly instead of casting long shadows. You squint again, trying to trace the runway's edges, but it's hopeless. The whole landscape is like a painting viewed through gauze, fuzzy, ambiguous, impossible to pin down. The oddest part is how serene it feels. For all its military intent, this camouflage has the quiet of rural life. Painted fields, false barns, glowing lanes of ghostly moonlight. It's like a stage set for a play no one gets to see, except the pilots who trust their lives to it each night. You take one last slow walk across the farm. The wind stirs the brush piled along the edges. The painted panels tremble faintly, and you realize how fragile the illusion really is. Up close, it's flimsy. From afar, it's brilliant. And that, perhaps, is the heart of camouflage itself. Reality doesn't need to be flawless, only believable enough to buy a moment's hesitation. The night deepens. You glance back once more, and the airfield has already melted away again. Just another patch of farmland stretching into the dark. You drift onward, the farmland airfields fading behind you, and soon your steps echo on cobblestones. Ahead, lanterns glow faintly, their light falling across rows of cottages. A village lies here, quiet, serene, its streets narrow and twisting. At least, that's what your eyes tell you at first. But your ears catch something different, the faint metallic clang of engines, the hiss of steam, the rumble of machines stirring beneath the earth. This is not a village. This is a decoy town. During WE, entire villages were fabricated from wood, tarpaulin, and canvas. phantoms erected in fields to fool enemy bombers. The British called them starfish sites. At night, they could be set alight with controlled fires, imitating burning cities after a raid. The idea was simple: lure enemy pilots into dropping their payloads on a fake town rather than a real one. From above, what the Luftwaffe saw was a blazing inferno, roofs collapsing and fires spreading. In reality, it was rows of oil drums or flares, and carefully engineered fuel patterns designed to mimic the spread of urban flames. You walk among these ghostly houses. Their walls are nothing but wooden frames stretched with cloth. The chimneys are hollow tubes painted with soot, some even puffing smoke from hidden oil burners to mimic the breath of real fires. Windows glint with mirrors that catch the faintest moonlight. Up close, the whole thing looks like a movie set, flat, fragile, ready to collapse if you lean on it. But from thousands of feet in the air, through the chaos of anti-aircraft fire and searchlights, it is convincing enough. The mainstream fact here: Britain constructed around 200 of these starfish decoy sites. Many were credited with saving real towns and factories from destruction. Coventry, Bristol, and London all benefited from these phantom cities. Some were even staffed by crews whose sole job was to light the fake town at the right moment, igniting flares and fires in a choreographed sequence that mirrored how real incendiary bombs spread across rooftops. And here's your quirky tidbit. One crew reportedly became so skilled that they could light their site in perfect synchronization with the actual city being bombed if Coventry took a hit. Within minutes, the decoy Coventry was burning too, complete with collapsing roofs of tar-soaked timbers, timed to match the real disaster. Enemy pilots flying over the flames sometimes radioed back gleeful reports, "Target destroyed." In truth, they had wasted tons of explosives on nothing but a field of illusions. You pause in the village square. A water pump stands in the middle, though when you touch it, the handle wobbles like cardboard. A signpost points to nearby towns, but the letters are smeared and crooked, painted in haste. It is absurd, this flimsy little place. And yet, under the cover of night, it may have saved hundreds of lives by luring destruction onto itself. Of course, not everyone was convinced of their success. Some historians argue that bombers rarely fell for the trick, pointing out that Luftwaffe crews often had precise orders and maps. Others counter that even a single wave of bombers misled by a decoy was worth the effort. The truth, as always, lingers in a haze, hard to pin down. You find yourself standing beside one of the fire traps, a shallow pit filled with oil-soaked straw, waiting for a signal flare. During a raid, the crew would ignite it, creating the illusion of a warehouse roof aflame. From above, dozens of such pits burning together looked like a city unravelling under firestorm. It was theatre, deadly theatre, with the sky as its audience. And here's a bit of dark humour whispered among the crews. Some of them joked that they weren't just stagehands but arsonists for hire. They joked about charging rent for their townhouses that didn't exist, or selling tickets to bombers to watch the show. In the blackest nights of the Blitz, laughter was a shield as much as sandbags. You continue through the phantom town. The doors creak though they open onto nothing. The streets twist into sudden dead ends, as though the architects gave up halfway. A barn looms on the edge, its silhouette perfect against the horizon, but up close it is just scaffolding draped in canvas, painted with brushstrokes wide and sloppy. And then, without warning, the crew on duty runs into action. A siren wails in the distance, somewhere beyond the horizon. You hear the throb of bombers approaching. With trained hands, the crew strikes matches, pours fuel, ignites the false village. Within moments, the night explodes into fire. Flames leap skyward, crackling and roaring. Thick smoke coils upward, blotting out the stars. From above, it is chaos, a city torn apart. From below, you know it is nothing more than burning barrels and clever timing. Still, the illusion is terrifying in its realism. You stand there, heat warming your face as the phantom town does its duty. Perhaps tonight it will fool the enemy. Perhaps it will save a real street, a real house, with real children tucked asleep in their beds. Perhaps, as the fire roars on, you step back into the shadows. The village, unreal as it is, feels alive in its destruction. You stand now in the dim light of a wartime factory floor, the kind that smells faintly of wet wool, paint thinner, and the nervous sweat of too many young recruits. The men and women here aren't just threading needles or cutting cloth, they're quietly reshaping how camouflage itself is conceived. After all, you can't paint every soldier like a tree trunk and expect them to blend in across the countless landscapes of Europe and the Pacific. Instead, clever minds turn to something deceptively simple: textiles. If the enemy could spot you by your outline, maybe the outline itself had to go. And so began the curious world of disruptive camouflage patterns, swirls, blotches, jagged edges, all meant to trick the eye into breaking a human form into unremarkable scraps of scenery. The British called it Denison smock. Imagine parachutists tumbling from the clouds, their bodies cloaked in a pattern that looked like a painter got distracted halfway through a forest landscape. The garment, first tested in the early 1940s, was sprayed with random shapes of brown and green, then dragged through a water bath so the colours bled together. It was messy, imprecise, and frankly, a little ugly. Perfectly ugly, in fact. The goal was never to win a fashion award. The goal was to dissolve a body against the hedgerows of Normandy. You picture some British colonel frowning at his own uniform, muttering, "Well, I look like a muddy hedge, don't I?" and realising that was the entire point. Meanwhile, the Germans weren't content to stay behind in the pattern game. They devised the so-called splinter pattern, sharp angular streaks that made soldiers look as though they'd been paper-cut by a woodland fairy. Then came P-dot camouflage, which sounds like something you'd wear to a picnic, but in reality was an intricate scattering of small dots in various shades of green and brown. The SS issued entire uniforms in these designs, and while historians still argue whether the patterns offered real tactical advantages or just psychological confidence, there's no doubt they sparked envy and imitation. Soldiers often reported feeling harder to hit when dressed in these blotches, whether or not the science backed them up. Across the ocean, American designers jumped into the fray. U.S. Marines fighting in the Pacific needed something different. Jungle foliage was not exactly the same as European farmland. The result was the reversible frog skin uniform. Green spots for the dense undergrowth on one side, sandy tan patterns for the beaches on the other. You can almost hear the grumbles of the supply officers trying to keep track of which side was supposed to face outward during which battle. The Marines wore them into places like Tarawa and Peleliu, sweating through the heavy fabric, trying to melt into the mangrove shadows. The experiment was short-lived, discontinued after the war, but it became a quirky collector's item decades later. You picture a sleepy veteran opening a trunk in his garage, pulling out the reversible jacket and muttering, "Guess I'm ready for both the jungle and the barbecue." Textile camouflage had its own fringe stories too. In the Soviet Union, experiments with patterned amoeba suits created ghostly blotches of pale green against darker cloth, a look that made soldiers resemble walking bacteria slides. And yes, Some Red Army designers genuinely thought that if you looked like you'd crawled straight out of a biology lab, the Germans might never notice you. Spoiler, they still noticed. But the amoeba suits lived on in military surplus shops, where modern airsoft players still occasionally stumble across them and giggle at the name. The quirkier side of these designs wasn't just about pattern, but fabric. In Britain, researchers tested different cloth treatments that would supposedly reflect less light or absorb more dirt. You could almost imagine a lab assistant carefully painting mud onto test swatches, waiting to see which fabric looked most convincingly boring. Historians still debate whether these incremental tweaks really fooled German optics, or were mostly busy work to keep the textile mills humming during wartime. Yet even the critics had to admit, disrupting the human outline mattered. A sniper hidden in foliage might survive because his smock broke his shoulders into fragments of colour. A paratrooper descending into a hedgerow might land unseen because his shape blurred into the earth. And in the strange way of war, soldiers began to feel comfort in these blotchy suits. They carried not just rifles, but the invisible reassurance that the fabric itself was on their side. You, lying back in your imaginary bunker bed, start noticing how this is all a grand stage trick. Camouflage isn't about making someone invisible, it's about making them forgettable, reducing a human silhouette into the background noise of leaves, grass, shadows. It's the art of becoming dull, which, ironically, is also the perfect recipe for drifting off to sleep. The next step in this dreamlike journey takes you from cloth and paint to something far more peculiar. The use of shadows, light, and even sound as tools of camouflage. Imagine standing at the edge of a foggy airfield where planes sit silently, their outlines softened with paint, but their shapes still giving them away. Some wonderfully eccentric engineer says, "What if we simply change the shadows?" And so begins the story of deception through manipulation of light. In North Africa, the British Army discovered that even when tanks were painted sand yellow, their long, hulking profiles betrayed them across the desert flats. A solution emerged from a most unlikely source: stage magicians. Men trained in theatre lighting came to the battlefield armed not with rifles but with spotlights and lamps, attempting to bend shadows so a tank might look like a truck or even disappear altogether. The most famous of these innovators was Jasper Mascaline, a stage magician who claimed he could hide entire divisions with mirrors, fake shadows, and elaborate props. Did he really conceal the Suez Canal with floating mirrors? Historians say probably not, but the rumours alone turned him into a wartime legend. There were smaller, verifiable tricks too. Some units experimented with dazzle shadows, artificial stripes painted on buildings or vehicles to make them appear crooked or shorter than they were. An enemy pilot looking down would see mismatched lines and struggle to judge the true size of the target. The effect was not perfect, but it bought precious seconds of hesitation, and in war, hesitation was priceless. Even aircraft designers tried to manipulate light itself. Some military experiments tested Yehudi lights, lamps mounted on the wings and nose of planes. The idea was simple but audacious. If an aircraft flew toward you with its front illuminated to match the brightness of the sky, your eye would not register its dark silhouette against the blue. In tests, bombers equipped with Yehudi lights could approach within a few miles before being noticed. The project was abandoned as radar advanced, but the thought of glowing planes sneaking across the horizon feels more like something from a surrealist painting than a battlefield. Sound, too, entered the realm of camouflage. You imagine a squad of engineers crouched around a giant speaker system, debating how to make tanks sound like trucks, or trucks sound like nothing at all. The Germans experimented with mufflers and sound-baffling panels, trying to make armoured engines less noticeable. In turn, the Allies faked tank noises to convince listening posts that armies were gathering where none existed. In the quiet desert nights, entire ghost armies came alive not by movement, but by carefully staged soundtracks of rumbling engines and clanking treads. Somewhere, a radio operator must have shaken his head, muttering, "Those are the loudest tanks I've ever not seen." Camouflage even extended to movement itself. During training, soldiers were taught to avoid straight lines and regular rhythms, since the human eye naturally latches onto patterns. Marching in perfect unison, ironically, could make you more visible. So, in certain operations, soldiers learned to stagger their steps, to sway slightly as they advanced, to carry branches or nets over their shoulders that broke up their marching silhouettes. The art of blending into the background was not just in what you wore, but in how you moved. This interplay of shadow, light, and sound was not without failures. Some experiments produced results so comical that soldiers couldn't take them seriously. One British prototype attempted to mount giant sunshades over tanks to soften their outlines, essentially turning them into mobile patio umbrellas. Needless to say, they collapsed in the desert wind and were quietly retired. Another test involved painting black windows on trucks to make them look like buses. From a distance, the disguise fooled no one, though the troops riding inside reportedly enjoyed pretending they were passengers on a very grim public transport line. Yet beneath the eccentricities was a serious truth. Deception thrived on uncertainty. If a soldier paused for even a moment, unsure whether he was looking at a tank or a truck, an aircraft or a patch of cloud, that moment mattered. War has always been about seconds, and camouflage, whether painted, lit, or sounded into being, was a way of stretching those seconds into survival. As you drift deeper into this history, you realize it mirrors something strangely calming. Just as shadows and light can soften the hard edges of a battlefield, your own mind softens its sharp outlines in the approach to sleep. Thoughts blur, details dissolve, and everything begins to fade into indistinct patterns. You, too, are practicing camouflage, blending into the darkness of night until you become part of it. Now the story shifts to something both playful and deadly serious, the art of dummy armies. Not merely painted nets or softened shadows, but entire legions conjured out of cloth, wood, and rubber. You imagine yourself standing in an open field at dusk, watching a team of soldiers inflate giant balloons. But these are not balloons for parades or children. They are rubber tanks, slowly taking shape until they stand full-sized, their bulky forms convincing enough to trick reconnaissance aircraft flying overhead. This was the work of the famed U.S. 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. Their mission was not to fight, but to deceive. Their weapons were inflatable tanks, fake artillery, canvas trucks, and elaborate soundscapes. Picture long lines of soldiers unrolling a canvas jeep from a truck, pinning it to a wooden frame, and stepping back as if to admire their handiwork. From above, it looked exactly like a convoy on the move. On the ground, it was closer to a travelling circus of illusions. But this circus had teeth. The Ghost Army was responsible for some of the most successful deceptions in World War II. At times, they created the illusion of entire divisions where none existed, tricking German commanders into repositioning forces. Their artistry went beyond props. They employed massive loudspeakers that blasted pre-recorded sounds of tanks clanking, men shouting and trucks revving. At night, villagers might hear the ghostly rumble of an army moving into position. Unaware it was nothing more than magnetic tape and speakers, the tricks weren't always perfect. Sometimes an inflatable tank collapsed in the wind, slowly deflating in front of bemused onlookers. There are stories of farmers walking past and tapping the rubber surface, chuckling to themselves. And yet, even when the ruse was discovered locally, its purpose held. What mattered was fooling the reconnaissance aircraft and enemy intelligence. A tank seen from the sky, even if made of canvas, still forced the enemy to react. The British too became masters of deception, particularly during the lead-up to D-Day, Operation Fortitude, the grand ruse to convince Hitler that the Allied invasion would land at Calais instead of Normandy, employed a dizzying array of dummies. There were entire fields of fake landing craft made of wood and canvas, arranged along the English coast. From the air, they looked like a massive fleet preparing to cross the Channel. There were phantom radio signals, carefully scripted chatter between units that didn't exist. Even a fictitious commander, General Patton, supposedly in charge of this phantom army. The deception was so convincing that Hitler held forces in Calais for weeks after the real invasion began. It is oddly charming, isn't it? To think that one of the greatest military operations in history was made possible not only by steel and blood, but by stagecraft, by rubber tanks and fake ships, by men who spent their war hammering wooden guns into the ground and painting shadows where none existed. The battlefield was a theatre, and camouflage its grand performance. Even outside Europe, dummy equipment played its role. In the Pacific, where islands dotted the ocean like stepping stones, American engineers crafted fake airfields. They built runways of painted cloth, fake planes made of bamboo and tarp, and bunkers filled with nothing but empty crates. Japanese bombers would waste precious ordnance striking these illusions, while real airstrips remained untouched just a few miles away. And there was humour, too, hidden within the seriousness. Soldiers in the Ghost Army recalled moments when they leaned against an inflatable tank to smoke a cigarette, or played cards beneath a wooden artillery piece, laughing at the idea that they were part of a phantom force shaping the war. It must have felt surreal, fighting a war not with bullets, but with brushstrokes, props, and recorded sounds. The effectiveness of these dummies rested on a simple principle. In war, perception is reality. If the enemy believes an army is gathering, they must act as though it is real. They divert forces, spend resources, and make decisions in response to a shadow. And sometimes, shadows can win battles. As you listen to this, the thought has a curious comfort. Just as these phantom armies lulled the enemy into hesitation, you find yourself lulled by the gentle absurdity of it all. Inflatable tanks, wooden ships, painted runways, tools of war that were, in some strange way, almost peaceful. They created delay, confusion, and space. And in that space, real soldiers lived who might otherwise have perished. Like the Ghost Army. Your own thoughts tonight inflate into shapes and illusions, moments from the day growing large and then slowly collapsing back into silence. You don't need to fight them, you only need to watch them drift by, as harmless as rubber tanks in the wind. The story now drifts toward another curious branch of deception, one less flamboyant than inflatable tanks, but equally ingenious: camouflage netting and natural disguises. Imagine yourself walking through a forest clearing during the war. The trees sway gently, the ground is soft with pine needles, and at first, everything seems ordinary. Then, as your eyes adjust, You realize the clearing isn't empty at all. Beneath carefully woven nets, entire batteries of artillery hide in plain sight. Camouflage nets were the unsung heroes of concealment. At a glance, they were nothing more than mesh covered with strips of burlap, hessian or dyed fabric, but draped properly. They could transform a hulking piece of machinery into nothing more than a bump in the landscape. Soldiers became artists, learning how to mimic the textures of leaves, grass, and earth. To them, netting was not just a cover, but a palette, a way to paint tanks, trucks, and guns into invisibility. In Europe, Allied engineers studied the landscape obsessively, matching the exact hues of farmland, hedgerows, and forests. In the desert, the palette shifted. Nets were bleached to match sand, speckled to echo shadows, or given irregular shapes to resemble boulders. You picture men crouched in the desert heat, carefully sprinkling sand over a net stretched across a truck, as though they were bakers dusting sugar over a cake, a cruel, sun-scorched cake, but one that could mean the difference between life and death. The Japanese, defending islands in the Pacific, became masters of natural disguise. They hollowed out hillsides and built bunkers within them, planting real vegetation on the roofs so the fortifications blended seamlessly into the jungle. American pilots flying overhead might look down and see only a lush canopy, never realizing that hidden within the green lay artillery and machine guns. The jungle itself became a weapon, swallowing entire battalions in shadows. Camouflage wasn't only about hiding from the sky. On the ground, deception reached into the smallest details. German snipers, for instance, stitched tufts of grass and moss directly into their uniforms, creating what we now call ghillie suits. Crouching low in fields, they became indistinguishable from the earth itself. A man could be lying just 20 feet away, invisible until he moved. The suit itself breathed with the landscape, alive with insects and dirt. Both uncomfortable and eerily effective, the Soviets added their own touch of creativity. During the Battle of Kursk, some Soviet tanks were camouflaged with live branches and shrubs tied directly to their turrets. Imagine these machines rolling forward like steel beasts covered in foliage, as though the forest itself had come to life. The image borders on absurdity. A tree with caterpillar tracks, creeping across a field. Yet in the fog of war, absurdity often became survival. And there were mistakes too. Sometimes comic, sometimes tragic. In North Africa, early attempts to hide vehicles with nets dyed the wrong shade of green stood out starkly against the golden desert. The effect was the opposite of concealment, like a patch of emerald grass painted onto sand. One British officer reportedly joked that the enemy didn't need reconnaissance planes, they only needed glasses. Lessons like these pushed camouflage units to refine their craft constantly, adjusting colours to seasons, studying shadows, and even considering how equipment looked at different times of day. It's strange to think of war turning men into students of light and texture. By day, they fought with guns. By night, they debated whether a net should be speckled with lighter paint to mimic sunlight filtering through leaves. Each detail mattered, because even a small inconsistency, a sharp shadow, an unnatural angle, could give away the illusion. You may picture yourself now in the twilight of a quiet forest, lying beneath one of those nets. The mesh above your head flickers with shadows, the edges lined with leaves. You listen to the soft rustle of fabric as it sways in the breeze, and for a moment, you feel perfectly hidden. The outside world cannot see you, and you are at rest. This is the paradox of camouflage. It was born of fear and necessity. Yet it carried with it a curious peace. To hide was to survive. To blend into the earth was to claim safety, however temporary, and in that safety, soldiers might close their eyes, even for a brief moment, and drift into sleep. Now, as you lie here listening, you too blend into your surroundings. The room is your landscape, the blanket your camouflage net, the day's worries, sharp and glaring, fade into softer shadows, hidden, unseen, and safe. You allow your body to disappear into rest. The dreamlike march of military deception drifts now into the world of dummy airfields and fake runways, whole landscapes built for no purpose other than to be destroyed. Imagine yourself floating above Europe at night during the height of the Second World War. Down below, the countryside glimmers faintly, dotted with small clusters of lights. At first glance they look like towns, or perhaps military bases, but as your gaze sharpens, you realize many of these bases are nothing more than elaborate stage sets. The British became particularly fond of this trick. They called them starfish sites, a name that sounded whimsical but masked their deadly purpose. These were decoy airfields, constructed far from real targets. Engineers laid out runways made of tarmac-coloured fabric, arranged oil drums to look like hangars, and even placed fake aircraft carved from wood. At night, special lamps flickered along the runway, imitating the glow of landing lights. To an enemy pilot flying at speed through clouds and darkness, the deception was almost perfect. When German bombers approached, the true magic began. Fires were set in carefully designed patterns, mimicking burning fuel depots or hangars struck by bombs. The illusion was so convincing that Luftwaffe squadrons released their payloads onto the false targets, sparing actual cities and bases. It was as if Britain had created whole sacrificial landscapes, decoys designed to absorb violence so that the real world might endure. One of the strangest details is how ordinary materials became weapons of illusion. Tin sheets, arranged at certain angles, reflected moonlight like pools of water. Simple wooden frames, stretched with canvas, became aircraft resting on fake runways. Even haystacks were repositioned to simulate bunkers or storage depots. You can imagine the quiet satisfaction of the engineers, working with rope and nails, knowing their creations would trick enemy eyes hundreds of feet above. The Germans used similar strategies, though with mixed results. In occupied France, they built dummy airfields complete with wooden planes and trucks. But the British, ever mischievous, sometimes mocked these efforts. Stories tell of Allied pilots dropping wooden bombs onto the fake airstrips, a cheeky way of saying, "We know your secret." Whether this tale is apocryphal or true, it captures the surreal humour that often accompanied deception in war. Elsewhere, the Soviets used false rail lines and dummy factories, built hastily from timber and cloth. These were painted to resemble smoke-stained industrial zones, complete with fake chimneys. German reconnaissance planes wasted valuable time photographing these decoys, often mistaking them for true production centres. The irony was sharp. Vast effort went into bombing piles of wood and canvas, while real factories continued humming somewhere beyond. You may imagine walking across one of these abandoned dummy sites today. The grass has grown over the false runway, the wooden frames have collapsed, and the lamps are long gone. At first, it looks like nothing at all, just another quiet field. But as you look closer, the ghosts of illusion return. The straight lines of the fake runway, the outlines of false hangars, the bones of wooden planes left to rot. There's something haunting about it, like discovering the ruins of a play performed for an audience that never applauded. There is a gentle strangeness in these stories, the idea that whole landscapes were built to die. The starfish sites were meant to be bombed, burned, and broken, all while real homes and cities slept nearby. To their creators, destruction was not failure, but success. Each bomb that fell on a fake airfield meant fewer bombs on London, Coventry, or Liverpool. The deception was grim, but it was also a kind of shield, fragile, theatrical, and profoundly human. As you let this story settle, imagine your own room as a decoy airfield of sorts. The shadows along the walls are the false runways, the gentle hum of night, a background disguise. The world outside may roar and threaten, but here inside, your mind has created a safe starfish site. The noise passes overhead, fooled by the glow of your thoughts, while you remain untouched. And with that realization, you can let go. The false airfields of the past have long faded into silence. The only fires now are the soft embers of memory, flickering gently until they, too, fade. Your body grows still, your breathing slows, and the stage lights of consciousness dim. You have built your own place of rest, your own illusion of safety, and unlike those wartime landscapes, this one is not meant to be destroyed, but to cradle you through the night. Now, let us drift into perhaps the most surreal layer of wartime deception, the realm of phantom armies. These were not just wooden planes or burning oil drums, but entire divisions that existed largely in the imagination. Picture yourself standing on a misty English hillside in 1944. Spread out across the fields below are row upon row of vehicles, tanks parked in neat lines, trucks clustered at crossroads, artillery pointing toward the coast. At first glance, the scene brims with military might, a formidable force ready to launch across the channel. But step closer, and the illusion wavers. The tanks are made of inflatable rubber, the trucks of canvas stretched over wooden frames, the artillery little more than pipes and scaffolding. You're in the presence of the Ghost Army, the American 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, nicknamed the Ghost Army, was a unit unlike any other. Its soldiers were not just fighters but artists, actors, sound engineers, and set designers. Their mission was theatre on a battlefield scale. Using inflatable vehicles, giant loudspeakers, and even fake radio chatter, they conjured armies from nothing, moving them across landscapes like stage props. At night, enormous rubber tanks were inflated, some so large that men inside them could feel the walls bow in the wind. Trucks were painted with false insignia, then driven in circles to give the illusion of entire convoys arriving. Meanwhile, sound crews blasted recordings of tanks rolling, men shouting and even hammering sounds, carrying across the fields for miles. German intelligence picked up these phantom movements and wasted precious time and resources preparing for battles that never came. One of their greatest feats came before the D-Day landings, while real forces prepared quietly in the south of England. The Ghost Army helped convince the Germans that the main invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Inflatable tanks were parked where spies could see them. Fake radio operators tapped out chatter in patterns that mimicked entire divisions. Even General George Patton, known for his aggressive command, was placed as the figurehead of this phantom force, adding credibility to the illusion. The ruse worked. German forces remained fixed at Calais for weeks, while the real invasion surged across Normandy's beaches. The Ghost Army's deceptions didn't end with D-Day. Later campaigns in France and Germany saw them create entire phantom divisions that appeared overnight in fields or forests. Civilians sometimes wandered into these strange camps, only to find rubber tanks deflating in the wind like collapsed balloons. There was humour in these moments, but also something profound. Artists wielding deception as a shield, saving countless lives not with bullets, but with imagination. The Germans, too, dabbled in phantom forces, though rarely with the same artistry. They built dummy rail lines, positioned fake guns along the Atlantic Wall, and painted entire divisions into existence on maps. But their illusions lacked the creativity of the Ghost Army's theatrics. It was as if the Allies had turned the very tools of Hollywood, props, sound, and spectacle, into instruments of war. You might imagine now, in the hush of night, that your own mind is a kind of ghost army. Each thought that drifts through is like an inflatable tank, impressive in shape, but not solid. Worries march in with loud boots, but they're only echoes from speakers hidden in the trees. Even the heaviest of burdens may prove, on closer inspection, to be nothing more than air stitched into fabric. Let this realization comfort you. The great phantoms of history saved lives by pretending to exist, and the phantoms of your mind hold no more weight than theirs. If you breathe deeply, the wind itself will carry them away, leaving only quiet fields behind. As your eyes grow heavy, picture the Ghost Army deflating its rubber tanks, rolling up its canvas trucks, and silencing its radios. The stage is packed away. The audience gone, the performance ended, and in that empty, peaceful landscape, you can find rest. You have no battles to fight tonight, only stillness, only sleep. Now, let us let our story draw to a close in the quiet company of shadows, reflecting on what these great wartime deceptions reveal, not only about strategy, but about the very nature of human imagination. When you look back over the tapestry of trickery, you see a world where the line between reality and illusion blurred in astonishing ways. Dummy tanks built of canvas and wood, phantom lights flickering across coastlines, smoke screens thick as night, and ghost armies conjured from rubber and sound. All these were works of invention as much as war. It was as if the battlefield itself had become a vast stage, with each side directing its own theatre of shadows, and in that theatre, victory did not always belong to the strongest, but to the cleverest. Illusions delayed invasions, drew fire away from real troops, and bought precious time. Wooden planes pulled bombs from the sky. Burning oil on the sea made whole coastlines impassable. Inflatable tanks forced enemy generals to misjudge entire campaigns. Countless lives were saved by things that were never real. Think of it this way. The greatest weapons of that age were not just tanks and bombers, but doubt, imagination, and misdirection. A soldier crouched in a muddy trench might never know that his safety came not from armour or artillery, but from a stage prop 2 valleys away. And in this realization lies something deeply human. We are creatures of stories, of signs and signals, of belief. What we perceive, we react to, whether it is truth or illusion. Now, as you lie here, listening to this quiet unraveling of history, let that same thought bring you ease. The anxieties that sometimes march through your mind are like phantom armies. They seem vast, noisy, and real, but upon closer inspection, they are only shadows projected on the walls of memory and expectation. Just as generals were fooled by wooden planes and rubber tanks, so too can the mind be fooled by its own illusions, but you're not bound to believe them. Instead, imagine yourself now as the quiet commander of your own thoughts. One by one, the decoys and dummies of worry are deflated, folded, and rolled away. The smoke screens of uncertainty drift apart on the breeze. The phantom divisions of doubt vanish back into silence. What remains is the truth, a still night, a gentle breath, and the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat. The great deceivers of history played their games to buy peace in the midst of war. You too can embrace that peace now, not through trickery, but through rest. The stage is empty, the lights dim, and the last illusion fades into the dark. And so, with the weight of history set aside, let your body grow heavy, your thoughts grow soft, and your eyes close. May the deceptions of the past stay safely in their time, and may your own night be filled only with truth, the truth of calm, of quiet, and of sleep. Good night, rest well,